Before I continue with this program and the latest developments, I'm going to return to a topic which I discussed in a video which I did 2 days ago, which is about the alleged murder of Russian prisoners by Ukrainian forces near a village in northern Donbass called Makeyevka. Well, the New York Times has now done an analysis of the video and apparently has done some investigation. And though it is careful to qualify its conclusions, it's always careful to say that not all the facts are clear. This analysis appears to corroborate to a very great extent the Russian allegations. It does seem as if, based on what the New York Times says, that a group of Russian soldiers who were indeed taken prisoner in the fighting were indeed shot through the head, close range, in what looks like extrajudicial executions. Well, I'm not going to have any expectations of any further action being taken with respect to this incident. The Russians say they know the names of all of the Ukrainian soldiers and officers who were involved, and that they don't expect Ukraine to take any action to track these people down and to bring them to justice, but the Russians say that they will do that themselves. How they will do that, of course, is an entirely different matter. Well, in my 2 previous videos, I've talked about a relatively quiet situation on the battlefronts. It seems that over the last 24 hours, it might have become rather less quiet, in that I am getting some reports that there are in fact ongoing Russian offensives underway, or at least Russian advances underway. There was a report from the Russian newspaper Redovka that there's been steady progress in and around Vuhledar. And indeed, an official, a military official, Russian military official, has spoken confidently of Vuhledar being captured by Russia sometime within the next few weeks. We'll see. And there's also been quite a lot of reports about more fighting going on in the village, I should say, of Marinka, which is one of these fortified villages near Donetsk city. And it's now apparently confirmed that the fighting is taking place at the center of Marinka. It's apparently extremely bitter. The Russian Air Force is operating against Ukrainian positions in Marinka. But the overall sense I'm getting from the reports is that Marinka is close now to falling fully under Russian control. So we'll see what more comes from there. And there's been some more reports now from the Russians about the situation in Bakhmut. This long-going battle that's been waged in Bakhmut city for quite a long time now. And the reports suggest that the fighting for Bakhmut is still going on, but the Russians again are saying that the Ukrainians have suffered such heavy losses in trying to defend Bakhmut that they've stopped their previous practice of counterattacking whenever the Russians gain ground in and around Bakhmut, and that they're now operating in a purely defensive way. Well, who knows? But anyway, that's what the reports say. Overall, however, the impression is that the Russians are making some progress on all of these battlefronts. Now, last night, I was also getting a whole flurry of reports that Ukraine has finally launched its long expected and anticipated offensive in Zaporozhye region to try to break through to the Sea of Azov, to try to cut off the Russian land bridge to Crimea. And by the way, there have been a lot of reports from Ukrainian officials about this, and about this being the first stage in a battle for Crimea itself. And there was even an article in the Daily Telegraph, the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which spoke of Ukraine recapturing Crimea by some point in early spring. I am going to say straight away that I think that is all, frankly, extremely unlikely to happen. And in the event, all of those reports that appeared yesterday about Ukrainian attacks in Zaporozhye, well, they turned out to be untrue. Now, overall, the general picture remains, as far as I can see, of relatively stable front lines, but with the Russians perhaps making gradual incremental progress in some of these places, in Marinka, in Vuhledar, perhaps in Bakhmut, as they're saying. And of the fighting that is going on, the actual advances being made by relatively small numbers of troops on each side, as they find it very difficult in the current difficult weather conditions to maintain or sustain offensive action. But we should not lose again sight of the underlying story, which is of the steady major Russian build-up underway of hundreds of thousands of Russian reservists being trained, gradually joining the Russian forces in Ukraine, preparing, no doubt, for this winter offensive. And there's now been a series of assessments by Western military commentators, by Scott Ritter, Daniel Davis, Douglas McGregor, all of whom seem to look forward to this major Russian offensive that looks likely, as it may happen, sometime in December or perhaps early January. I'm going to add that there's also reports circulating that the Russians have given Ukraine a warning that unless Ukraine starts to negotiate in earnest sometime around December, early January, all sorts of things which are very uncomfortable for Ukraine will start to happen. And there's talk that there will be a major Russian missile strikes around this time to knock out what's left of the Ukrainian energy system, that the Russians will launch further attacks on Ukraine's gas transportation system, knocking that out of service, and perhaps, just possibly, they will do what I've been discussing in various videos. They'll finally launch that offensive against the Dnieper bridges as well. Well, we'll have to wait and see, and we'll have to wait and see what the Russians are going to do. And, of course, I can't confirm these reports that such a warning from the Russians has indeed been given. But in the meantime, certain other things are taking place which, to be frank, don't seem to have a particular military rationale behind them. Over the last 3 days, Ukraine has resumed shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Now, I say that it's Ukraine shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant because, of course, Russia occupies the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Its troops are there, and I cannot myself believe that the Russians would shell a facility which they themselves control. I really am unable to see the logic of the Russians doing this. Besides, there have been articles in the US media which have conceded in the past that it is indeed Ukraine that shells the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So that makes complete sense to me, that it should be Ukraine that is indeed shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It is what the Russians always say. Now, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mr. Grossi, is once more off to Kiev and Moscow to try to bring this shelling to a stop. He says that it is dangerous, and he says it is irresponsible. And yet, once again, he undermines his credibility, and I can't help but feel his effectiveness as well, by going to extraordinary lengths to avoid saying that it is Ukraine that is shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And in doing so, undoubtedly he is following the tune set by the IAEA's board, which is of course dominated by the Western powers, and which in effect has criticized the Russians for taking steps with respect to Ukraine's nuclear energy facilities. Well, I don't know whether the Western powers, or indeed Mr. Grossi, have been given assurances in private by the Ukrainians that whatever shelling they carry out of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, it won't be directed at any of the really sensitive facilities of the power plant. But I have to say that this whole episode of Ukraine shelling a nuclear power plant and Western governments, most of the Western media, apart, as I said, from those brief admissions in the US media, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, all of them colluding with each other to pretend that the shelling could be the work of the Russians. I think all that this is doing is that it is destroying the reputation of the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is the consistent pattern, by the way, with so many of these international regulatory agencies, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and now we see it again with the International Atomic Energy Agency and with the many various bodies of the UN Secretariat. They've all, since the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, they've all somehow or other aligned themselves completely with the West. I get the impression that around the time of the Iraq War of 2003, there was a systematic policy of bringing all of these various international bodies to heel and ensuring that in future they reliably report whatever version of the facts suits Western governments. All I will say about that is that for the moment, countries like Russia and China are gritting their teeth and continuing to work within these agencies, but with the credibility of these agencies being shot to pieces, the real risk exists that at some point some of these major non-Western powers may decide that the time has come to simply pull out of them, perhaps to set up rival agencies of their own, or at least to have no further dealings with these agencies. In that case, then another part of the structure, the regulatory structure that underpins arms control across the world, will have been further undermined and will have broken down. And the world, which is already becoming altogether too dangerous, is going to become more dangerous still. Anyway, whilst I'm on the topic of Ukraine shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and we'll see, by the way, for how long that continues, there's been another curious development from Ukraine itself, and that is that President Zelensky has, for the second time in a week, been caught out in a lie. Now, in my program yesterday, I mentioned the fact that Zelensky had made a virtual address to a conference in Halifax in the United States, which General Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, had also attended. I didn't discuss, because I didn't take seriously, Zelensky's claim that the Russians had contacted Ukraine and had asked for supposedly a short truce. The idea being, presumably, that there would be a short truce and Zelensky, for each side to sort of sort out its problems. And Zelensky said that he had in fact rejected this proposal, this Russian proposal, for a short truce, because the Russians would simply use that period to consolidate their military positions in eastern Ukraine. Except, of course, a few hours later, another Ukrainian official, one of Zelensky's aides, a man called Yermak, has come forward and has actually said that the Russians never did, in fact, propose anything like a short truce to Ukraine. Indeed, it seems that there are, at this present point in time, no real contacts of any kind between Ukraine and Russia, no diplomatic contacts. So, the interesting part of that story is not that Zelensky said something which wasn't true. In my opinion, Zelensky mostly says lots of things which it turns out subsequently are not true, but that he was contradicted almost immediately by a member of his own team, by a member of his own government. And this has been consistently true now for some time. We've had that extraordinary incident with the Ukrainian missile that landed in Poland, and we've seen contradictions, the Western governments contradicting Zelensky over this, despite Zelensky's anger and his fervid attempts to insist that it was indeed a Russian missile. And we've had now this other example of a Ukrainian official this time coming forward and saying that this latest story of Zelensky's about the short truce, that this isn't true. By the way, the Russians remain a stony silence on that whole allegation about the short truce. So, given that this is so, what is going on in Kiev? I can't help but feel that over the last couple of days, we've seen growing exasperation with Zelensky on the part of a great many people, both in the West and in Ukraine itself, in the political leadership of Ukraine. And I noticed, by the way, that some media outlets in the West have misrepresented something that Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, said shortly after his meeting with Zelensky in Kiev, that somewhat mysterious visit of Sunak's to Kiev, which I talked about yesterday. Some have said that Sunak said publicly that Britain would continue to support Ukraine until it had won. But that's not, in fact, what Sunak actually said. What Sunak, in fact, said, and I am quoting this from memory, so I may not have got his exact words, but he said that Britain would support Ukraine until it had won a peace that it deserved and would leave it secure. Now, that's not quite the same as Sunak simply saying that Britain will support Ukraine until it's won. It's much more qualified. In fact, it's not entirely far removed from the Russian position back in March, the position that the Russians had negotiated with the Ukrainians back in March, which very nearly came to the point of ending the war. whereby Ukraine would drop its insistence on joining NATO and would agree to remain a neutral state, would agree instead to accept security guarantees from the great powers, including Russia, by the way, guarantees that would ensure its security, but that these guarantees would not cover Crimea and Donbass, thereby in effect Ukraine accepting that these two regions, Crimea and Donbass, would break away and would no longer be part of Ukraine. Now you could argue that that was a peace, that the kind of peace that Ukraine might deserve and which could ensure its security. Not, as I said, so very different from what Rishi Sunak said when he was in Kiev. It's a significant shift, and it's echoed in the similar words by Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, who I notice is now talking about an acceptable peace. Acceptable to whom? Again, it seems to fall short of a demand for total victory. Now, I spoke at some length in my previous video about the extreme danger of the West's overcommitment to Ukraine, of the way in which General Austin was talking about how this war in Ukraine was going to shape the entire 21st century, and I said that it was utterly reckless of the Western powers to let themselves get drawn into a conflict in Ukraine, which could shape the whole 21st century to their disadvantage in a theater, Ukraine, where a previous American president, Barack Obama, admitted that the other side, the Russians, have escalatory dominance, as we are, in effect, seeing working out in Ukraine at the moment. So given that this is all the case, I said that it made sense for the Western powers to try to look for a way out. Well, perhaps that is what they're doing. Perhaps they've concluded, or at least perhaps some of them have concluded, that in fact the military situation in Ukraine has now run its course. Ukraine's offensives have now run their course. They're not going to achieve this great breakthrough in Zaporozhye that people have been talking about. The Russian forces are gradually growing in strength and power. I noticed, by the way, that in one of its recent updates, the British Ministry of Defence admitted that the Russian forces had evacuated from the right bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region in good order. And it attributed all of this, by the way, to the skillful leadership of General Surovikin. Quite a curious admission coming from the British Ministry of Defence. But anyway, that was its admission. So given that all this is the case, it's looking increasingly unlikely that Ukraine is going to achieve any further major advances on the battlefields. Whereas the Russians are getting stronger, they're getting more troops on the ground, they're probably making progress in Vuhledar, they're probably making progress in Marinka and in other places near Donetsk city. They're probably making progress in that endless battle that's been fought in Bakhmut, and they seem to have successfully brought all of those Ukrainian offensives in northern Donbass towards Kremenna and Svatovo. They seem to have brought all of those offensives to an end. Indeed, there's even a Russian claim that there's now tensions between Ukrainian officers on the front lines in this area of northern Donbass, near Svatovo and Kremenna, and they're complaining that Kiev doesn't seem to understand their problems, that it's constantly ordering them to go on to the offensive in those areas, and they're finding it impossible to do so, that the Russian defenses are simply too strong, and that they're losing men and machines by constantly being pushed into these offensives. And by the way, whilst I'm on the topic of the offensives, the Ukrainian attempted offensives towards Svatovo and Kremena, I've seen some pretty harrowing pictures again of the landscape littered with the bones. I literally mean the bones, because in some cases the corpses have become skeletonized of Ukrainian soldiers who are lying strewn on the fields, unburied, in these desperate offensives that Ukraine is launching in northern Donbass, and which don't seem to be making any progress at all. Anyway, it seems that, there are people in the West who are looking at all of that and who are looking at the growing problems of Ukraine's economy. And if it is indeed the case that the Russians have given warnings that they will move sometime in the midwinter, perhaps in tandem with their major offensive to break Ukraine's energy system, and perhaps its gas transportation system, and who knows, perhaps even the bridges across the Dnieper. Perhaps there are Western officials who are now starting to worry about this, and that all these little voices, these little murmurings that one's seeing about Zelensky, which are now being picked up in Kiev itself, that they're all part of some plan to replace Zelensky, or perhaps to put pressure on Zelensky to get him to sit down and to negotiate. Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. But in the meantime, one does get the sense that Surovikin's attrition war is continuing to have its effect. He's continuing to grind the Ukrainians down. He's grinding them down near Vuhledar. He's grinding them down near Donetsk, and perhaps in other places too. And of course, the missile strikes, the attacks on the energy system, well, they're having their effect as well. Now, all of this is coming against, obviously, deteriorating economic conditions in the West. And again, you have to live in Britain to see the succession of articles which have been appearing in every part of the British media, which talk about the deteriorating economic situation in Britain, and how Britain is now in a state of decline, and apparently unstoppable economic decline. There doesn't seem to be anybody in Britain with any clear plan of how to turn things round. But perhaps interestingly enough, there was also a long article today in the Financial Times which talked about the rise in protests against the war, against the confrontation with Russia in eastern Germany, the territory of the former German Democratic Republic, but also in other Central European states as well, especially Austria, where the Freedom Party, right-wing Freedom Party, which has come out strongly opposed to sanctions and indeed to the entire Ukraine policy, is now level in the opinion polls at number one, and might at some point overtake the other parties and emerge as the biggest party in the Austrian opinion polls. And of course, Austria is a country where I understand elections are due fairly soon. And the Financial Times journalists who write about these protests in eastern Germany, so far they seem to be mainly concentrated in eastern Germany. But the Financial Times points out that they are bringing together in Eastern Germany both supporters of the left, of Die Linke, and of the right, the AfD, and significantly, or perhaps not so much significantly, perhaps more symbolically, they're taking place, these protests, which are perhaps not enormous, but growing in size, that these protests are taking place in precisely the same locations in Leipzig and elsewhere, where the protests wave that eventually swept away the East German Republic, the East German government, the German Democratic Republic, began in 1989, and that they seem to bring together both sides, both sectors of East German politics, Die Linke and the AfD. And that the West German government, or rather the German government, but of course it remains in some ways very firmly rooted in West Germany, is becoming increasingly concerned about all of this, just as it is becoming increasingly concerned about the protests in Austria. Austria being, of course, an important EU member state. And this, of course, has come after there's been this huge row over migrant flows between Italy and France, between the new Italian Prime Minister, Miss Meloni, and the French President, Emmanuel Macron. And one does get the impression that Meloni and Macron, well, I don't know to what extent they've ever met, but it seems that they are not friends, that they don't like each other. And we also are seeing growing criticism from some curious parties about the way in which the United States is supposedly exploiting Europe's economic problems to its own advantage. Both President Macron of France and the German Vice Chancellor and Economics Minister, Robert Habeck, have now come forward, and they both complained that President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is providing subsidies which are attracting European industrial groups to relocate from Europe, where energy costs are 5 times higher than they are in the United States. And of course, it provides them with more subsidies. This Inflation Reduction Act provides more subsidies, attracting even more European industries to relocate to the United States. And both Habeck and Macron, apparently oblivious or unwilling to recognize their own role in bringing about Europe's economic crisis, are now complaining bitterly about this, just as they've both of them been complaining bitterly about the cost, the price of liquefied natural gas exports from the United States to Europe. So all of these angry criticisms coming on top of all of these protests in Eastern Germany, the rise of the Freedom Party in Austria, protests elsewhere in Eastern Europe. So a winter of discontent, maybe, in Europe. Certainly a mood of deepening gloom in Britain, and a military situation in Ukraine which is starting to shift. Perhaps all of this does pave the way for a diplomatic initiative of some kind. Now, the Russian presidential spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, in response to comments made by a senior member of the Russian parliament, has insisted that so far Russia is not seeking regime change in Kiev. Now, bear in mind that Peskov is saying this. He's saying this directly after the deputy chair of Russia's Defense Council, Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, as I discussed yesterday, spoke about Kiev as a once and perhaps future Russian city. And the deputy chair of the Duma, the Russian parliament, in those comments which provoked Peskov's words, well, this deputy chair of the Duma actually said that there is no possibility of negotiations with Ukraine whilst the present government remains in power in Kiev. It's shown itself repeatedly unable to conduct negotiations. Well, Peskov said, so far that's not our plan. It's not the intention to achieve regime change. The Russians don't have any, they're not seeking regime change in Kiev. But he did also say that all of the objectives of the special military operation outlined by President Putin when he launched it back in February will be achieved. And these, of course, include demilitarization and the purging of Ukraine of its of a particular ideology that's left over from the 1930s. Again, I'm being careful in my choice of words. And Peskov says that there are various mechanisms whereby this could be achieved, short of the Russians engaging in regime change themselves. Could it be, might it be the case that the Russians know that there are moves afoot in the West to try either to clip Zelensky's wings or perhaps to shuttle him aside in order to put in place someone else who can take over and bring Ukraine to a credible negotiation process? I have to say, when you read Peskov's words carefully, it does seem to me that he does appear to leave the last option open. Who knows? Anyway, in the meantime, whilst all of these things are going on in Ukraine, whilst this conflict in Ukraine continues, all sorts of other things are taking place in the world. Turkey has retaliated to this terrorist attack in Istanbul, which the Turks insist was the work of the Kurds, by launching major airstrikes across northern Syria, principally targeting the Kurds. And today, President Erdogan of Turkey has talked about the fact that Turkey might be considering a ground operation in northern Syria. Now, Erdogan was careful to say that the reason this is happening is because the Russians have failed to rein in the Kurds in northern Syria. But of course, everybody knows that the true patron of the Kurds in northern Syria is the United States. And very pointedly, when the original terrorist incident took place in Istanbul, Turkey refused to accept a message of condolence from the United States. So it seems likely that if this is going to lead to a Turkish attack in northern Syria, it will be primarily directed at the Kurds in those areas where the United States has predominant influence. So we have all of that going on. There are rumbles of disquiet in the Balkans. There seems to be an increasing crisis developing between Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo, of course, which Serbia continues to see, as does much of the world, as a breakaway Serb province. And there's talk that the Kosovo authorities are going to try to crack down on the Serb population in Kosovo, and the Serb government has made it very clear that if that happens, the Serbian military will intervene to protect the Serb people in Kosovo. And then another event has taken place, one which has been almost completely ignored by the international media, and that is that the civil war in Ethiopia, the war between Tigray province and the Ethiopian government, has abruptly ended with the capitulation of the Tigrayan forces. I say capitulation. There was an agreement apparently brokered by South Africa, but it's very difficult for me to see this agreement, as it's been explained or set out, as anything else than a capitulation on the part of the Tigrayans. Now, the Tigrayans became involved in this conflict with the Ethiopian government about 2 years ago. It seemed for a time that they were making spectacular progress, that they inflicted defeats on the Ethiopian army. There was even some talk that they might capture Addis Ababa. But Ethiopia recovered, it rebuilt its army. In fact, it seems to have built up a much bigger army than the Tigrayans, and it put Tigray, the whole region of Tigray, under effective siege, together with its ally Eritrea. And eventually the Tigrayans were forced to agree to this peace agreement, which in effect places Tigray under the control of the Ethiopian federal government. Now, this is an interesting affair, in part because the conflict in Ethiopia divided on geopolitical lines. Russia and China backed Ethiopia, and the United States backed the Tigrayans. And in fact, there was even a rather embarrassing recording of a meeting between US officials and the Tigrayans, in which one couldn't escape the sense that the Americans were basically egging the Tigrayans on. Perhaps this is an important lesson for the Ukrainians to digest. I just mention it because the United States does seem to have been involved in the Ethiopian civil war in some way. It does seem to have encouraged the Tigrayans to launch their insurgency against Ethiopia. But Ethiopia, backed by China and Russia and its ally Eritrea, counterattacked and has apparently prevailed. And whatever assurances, whatever promises, whatever inducements the United States seems to have given to the Tigrayans, those don't seem to have amounted to anything very much, and certainly not enough to enable the Tigrayans to prevail against the much larger and far more powerful country, which is Ethiopia. I can't help but think that the moral with Ukraine is the same. It's, by the way, remarkable how little interest there is in the fact that the Ethiopian civil war has ended so suddenly and with such a capitulation on the part of the Tigrayans. The Western media, a couple of months ago, before the Ukraine war began, was full of stories about the war in Ethiopia. All of these stories very much, by the way, supportive of Tigray. And now that there's been this peace agreement on Ethiopian government terms, there's almost no reporting of this agreement at all. The only one I found is in Responsible Statecraft, which is, of course, very much a specialist journal run by the Quincy Institute in the United States. So I can't help but think that perhaps the Ukrainians might want to heed what has happened to the Tigrayans, because it's clear to me that the Tigrayans were led up the garden path. They were induced, as I said, to launch this or engage Ethiopia in this conflict. But then, when Ethiopia responded with all its vastly bigger resources and with the backing of China and Russia, most particularly of Russia, the United States was in no position to do very much, and the whole story was switched off. And I'm going to make a prediction. I think that if we see Turkey come after the Kurds in a serious way in Syria, then again, it'll be the same pattern. All the brave words of support for the Kurds that we've been hearing from all sorts of people in the West, in the United States, will in the end be seen to mean very little. Kurdistan, the Kurds in Syria, will be sacrificed because the United States is not in a position to engage Turkey in some armed conflict. That is impossible. So the United States has let its Tigrayan friends down, as some would say. It's probably going to let its Kurdish friends down too before long. And at some point, it's going to do the same with Ukraine. All of those brave words of support that we're hearing, which we see are now becoming qualified. We'll see that probably, and in the end, they're going to mean very little. Well, there we go. That's, I think, where we are. At the moment, quiet before the storm. I think those were Douglas McGregor's words to describe the situation at the moment in Ukraine, and I think that's probably about right. Major Russian build-up going on, probable Russian advances in Vuhledar and near Donetsk city, and quite possibly Bakhmut. Ukraine suffering very, very heavy losses. Murmurings apparently against Zelensky, both in the Western media and in Ukraine itself. And Ukraine going into a deepening economic crisis under the pressure of the Russian missile attacks. And whilst all the focus of the world is on Ukraine, American allies in Tigray have been forced to capitulate, and American allies in Syria, the Kurds, are apparently about to come under intense pressure. Also, real risks now of a major explosion in the Balkans between Serbia and Kosovo, which could have very unpredictable consequences for the situation in the Balkans, to put it mildly. And of course, all of this on top of a general economic crisis in Europe, which is now creating protests, a protest wave in East Germany, the rise of the Freedom Party in Austria, a party that is straightforwardly pro-Russian and wants to see the sanctions lifted. And of course, all of this shortly after the victories of Meloni and her movement in Italy and the Democrats in Sweden. Meloni, who has just had this huge row with Emmanuel Macron. So a difficult winter is lying ahead. Perhaps negotiations are going to come. Perhaps there's going to be a general quiet recognition that this has got to end in some way. This is not, in my opinion, a war that can just be swept aside and forgotten in the way that the Ethiopian war has been. A war in Europe, Ukraine, Russia, I suppose, still technically at least part of Europe, is not something that can just be hidden under the carpet, disappeared down a memory hole. There's far too many Ukrainian refugees in Europe, for example, to make that possible. And far too many things have been said, and far too many things have been done. And there's all this massive problem of the sanctions as well. But it could be that as the West tires of this conflict and as it starts to see the writing on the wall with this Russian build-up, that negotiations will take place. We'll see. Anyway, to repeat again, if Ukraine wants to see how true the words of, I believe it was Henry Kissinger, it might have been someone else, that it's dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but even more dangerous in some way to be its ally, well, they could do better. The Ukrainians could do no better than to see what has happened to the people in Tigray and what is probably very soon going to happen to the Kurds. And that point, I'm going to end this program today. Obviously, over the next couple of days, I suspect the situation in Ukraine was going to continue to remain quiet. If there's going to be any major military moves, I expect them to be made by the Russians, and I expect them to take place probably mostly in Vuhledar, perhaps around Donetsk. But the overall sense I still get is of a conflict that people in the West have become tired of, that's losing traction, and in which the Russians, having, as I said before, weathered the storm, are waiting to be resolved on their terms. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Remember, you can get all our videos on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and of course also on Rockfin. And also, please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can check out our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel, and have an excellent day until we speak again. Thank you for joining me. More from me soon.